Have you noticed that GPUs are demanding quite a bit more power these days than previously? We got the 6800 XT and the 3090. The 3090 is like 450 watts at which is a little bit of tweaking. I mean, it's 350 watts TGP, but it will trip the overcurrent protection even on 700, 750 watt power supplies. Some of them. That's been a problem that's been reported on our forums and elsewhere. So if you're wanting to build a small form factor system, like in this Dan Case A4 or something else, which I've got this really amazing little Asetek cooler for, it gets to be a little problematic. Enter Cooler Master. This is an SFX power supply. It's very small, but it's 850 watts, more than enough to power all of this, even a 75 watt, USB-C VR headset hanging off of the USB-C port on the RX 6800 XT, which is something that NVIDIA jettisoned on the 3000 series cards. You know, they had it on the 2000 series cards, like the 2080 Ti, 2070, 2080. They had that USB-C connector, to power a VR headset, but they just didn't have the power budget to do it with the 3080 and the 3090. So let's take a look. All right, so first up, what do you get? Well, this is an 80 plus gold power supply. It's SFX, not SFXL, which means that it's only 100 millimeters long. That's something you have to look for because not every SFX power supply is the same. Some of them are a little longer than others. Most cases, like the Dan Case A4, they're compatible with the longer power supplies. Okay, well, the Dan Case A4, you'd be really tight at the bottom here. But with modular power supply and stuff like that, it's really not recommended. Same thing with the Dr. Zaber Sentry. You can use the SFXL in it, but you got to use a special power button because it sort of intrudes on the power button area. And if I'm going to try to also shove at some point this fantastic Asetek cooler in my little Dan Case A4 and also cram a GPU in here, like the 6800, a 2-slot card, or a 3080, the Founders Edition, also a 2-slot card, well, I don't have a lot of room to play around in here, do I? The problem is this 450 watt power supply. This 450 watt power supply is not even remotely enough. Even if I were running a 65 watt CPU, if I were to say run that with the 3090, it would immediately turn off because the GPU is using so much of the power supply's budget, and it can ramp from 200 watts to 350 watts and beyond, that it's going to shut down this power supply because of its overcurrent protection. So this has a built-in 92 millimeter fan. It is the, as I mentioned, it's the SFX form factor. Now, fun fact, most SFX power supplies also come with an ATX bracket. So if you wanted to use this in place of an ATX power supply, you could, although you pay a price premium for doing that. So you'd have to have a good reason for doing that. Let's unbox. Here's your ATX adapter bracket, a bunch of zip ties, and Velcro straps, so you've got options here. Mounting screws, standard issue, and then of course the power supply is fully modular, so you get a lot of modular cables. But this is important because there are cable vendors that will sell you a specialized cable kit that will work specifically with cases like the Dan Case A4, really popular ones, the Dr. Zaber Sentry, and other small form factor cases. There you are. Now, one thing to note about this power supply is this 92 millimeter fan is not going to spin at all as long as the load is under 15%. And that is a very realistic possibility. I mean, 15% of 850 watts, you could very well be at that power limit just idling at the desktop with a modern Ryzen CPU. You get your GPU in there and it's not really doing much. You get your CPU in there, it's not really doing much. 15% power budget for no fan RPM is entirely possible that the fan is just not going to spin even when you're sitting at the desktop. Now you can really feel this thing's got some heft to it. Cooler Master's definitely done their homework here. In terms of connections, you get the motherboard connections. You've got 4 8-pin connections, which are for PCIe power or CPU power. And then you've got 3 peripheral connections, which is in the bag a mix of SATA and the old style Molex connectors. Now, one thing I'll call specific attention to is the number of PCIe connections that you get. You get 2 CPU cables. I'm not aware of any ITX motherboards that have 2 CPU connections for sending 800 watts through the through the motherboard. And you also get 2 PCIe peripheral cables, each of which have 2 PCIe device connections. Now this is really important, this is super critical. On these modern GPUs that have multiple connections, both of these have the equivalent of an 8-pin power connection. You're going to want to use 2 separate cables. I know the temptation is I could use one of these 4-pin cables and use 2 connections and satisfy the physical requirements of these GPUs. But in reality, you really need to use both of these, especially with the higher end GPUs like the 3080 and the 3090 in terms of their power requirements. It's really kind of over the moon. If you're going to be running VR or something like that with the RX 6800 XT, it's pretty critical for it as well. So it's a, it's an equal opportunity playing field in terms of ridiculous power requirements of your GPUs and your entire system. Now, I would have liked for Cooler Master to include another PCIe power connection, because at the power supply end, the pinout is the same. So like this connection, this is a PCIe power cable, and this is the connection that goes into the power supply. This is different than this end that goes into your peripherals. Don't mix that up. But on the CPU side, so we have these CPU power cables. This side, which is labeled CPU, is a different pinout than this end here. So it's labeled CM-PSU on the end that goes into the power supply, but between the CPU power cable and the GPU power cable, these are identical cables. So it would have been really awesome if Cooler Master had included an extra PCIe peripheral cable, because a lot of these small form factor systems just don't have multiple CPU connections. But it is nice to have both in case you're building a small form factor system like the ones that we built with the Sliger cases that do actually support motherboards that are larger and have higher end power delivery, and would actually use both of those connections. That said, at the end of the day, this is still an 850 watt power supply. You're not going to be running SLI 3090s. One, because SLI is sort of on its way out, but two, 850 watts ain't enough for that. So testing, how does the testing go? Well, for testing, we spent about an hour playing games with this on both the 3090 and the 6800 XT. Now I'm doing a build with this power supply also in the Cooler Master NR200. The really amazing thing about the NR200 is that it perfectly supports these triple slot GPUs. Those other compact ITX cases like the Dan Case A400 and the Dr. Zaber Sentry build, those are very specialized builds. It's very easy to purchase components that are going to be incompatible with those cases because they're physically too large, too long, or you get a power supply where just the placement of the cables makes things difficult. Like cramming this in to the A400 with my Asetek cooler, because of the modular nature of this power supply, means that those cables are sort of jammed into the fans on this particular cooling setup. If you've got a case like Cooler Master's NR200, this is not an issue. The NR200 is a great case where you don't have to be quite as careful. You can always use a website like PC Part Picker, which will kind of help you. If users run into compatibility issues, they flag it on the website. And so if you use a case like the NR200, you can still support these ginormous GPUs. You can still have an 850 watt power supply. So it's basically a no compromises build, even though it's a small form factor build. And it's still a relatively compact case. I mean, yeah, the Sentry and the Dan Case A4 are much smaller cases, but there's a trade-off there, in terms of how do you deal with the heat and can you use any component and so on and so forth, whereas the NR200, you don't really have to worry about those kinds of things as much. And you also have a lot more room for more fans that can move at a lower RPM and be quieter for moving the same amount of air. So overall, not bad. I'm very impressed with this power supply. This is also, I'll also call out that this supports 120 watts on everything that's not 12 volts and 849.5 watts on 850 watts. So the total power through this thing is limited to 850 watts. But almost all of that 850 watts can be on the 12 volt rail. So it truly is an 850 watt power supply. You gotta always check that, because when you're looking at a power supply, you might be looking at two 850 watt power supplies, and you might have one that can only deliver 700 watts or 750 watts on the 12 volt rail, and all of the other voltages, sort of add together. The power supply manufacturers, to make it a little easier to do the back of the envelope math when you're looking at CPU power, which uses 12 volt rail, and GPU power, which uses the 12 volt rail, when you look at that, it's a little easier to figure out, okay, almost all of my power requirements here are going to be on 12 volts. Is 850 watts going to be enough? And you got to check the fine print on a power supply, because it can be an 850 watt power supply that can't deliver 850 watts on just 12 volts. But this one can deliver 850 watts on just 12 volts, if that's what your system calls for. So again, Cooler Master has done it right. Good job, Cooler Master. I'm Whittle, this is level 1. This has been a quick look at the Cooler Master 850 watt, SFH AGV MPY 8501. It's the Cooler Master 850 watt SFX power supply. Gold, 80 plus gold. So I'm signing out, and I'll see you later. If you build a system with one of these, show it off in the Level 1 forums. I'd love to see pictures. This one's going to be in quite a few of our upcoming systems because it's hard to find. What's hard to find components in general, one, but two, it's hard to find 850 watts in this form factor. Whew. And these GPUs, they need it if you're going to build a really powerful little, lunchbox system, portable system, whatever. It's good stuff. Catch you later. Gotta wait for the boiler snake.